Latino student organization at UCLA Law School that every year sponsors an outreach event to high school students in the Los Angeles area. It's also important to mentor the people here at Berkeley on this campus who are arriving and can benefit from what you have to share. There is a recent article in the Harvard Education Review called Results Not Typical, One Latino Family's Experiences in Higher Education. And the article describes the experience of Ricardo Jimenez, who was the son of immigrant parents. He talks about how he struggled at UC Irvine until he joined an organization called Mexican American Engineers and Scientists, or MAES. Ricardo had been on academic probation, but by joining peers in study groups, looking at previous tests and notes that other club members had, and enjoying their company as friends and colleagues, he was able to stay in the engineering program and graduate. He describes joining MAES as, quote, the turning point of my academic focus at UCI, end quote. And he highlights the importance of having a mentor who understood the balance he was trying to achieve between his work, his family obligations, and his studies. Ricardo's story shows that you can be a resource and make a difference in someone's life. Now, third, I think, and despite these difficult odds, I think Latino community groups, educational organizations, and civil rights advocates must continue to press for reform, and I want to give you an example. The Obama administration has put unprecedented monies into education, and I think that is laudable. But a lot of the money is tied up in a program called Race to the Top. And if you look at the results of the two competitions, in the first competition, only 2 states received grants, Delaware and Tennessee. And in the second round, awards were made to the District of Columbia, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and Rhode Island. Now, New York and Florida are high immigrant receiving states with significant Latino populations. But notably missing from this list is the western half of the United States, if you don't count Hawaii. And in particular, California and Texas have not received any support through this program, even though these 2 states together educate about half of all Latino students in the nation. So of those 41 million in the nation, about 20 million are in California and Texas. So if the Latino educational crisis is to be addressed in a meaningful way, the solutions have to begin in states like California and Texas, where we're educating the bulk of Latino students. Now, I talked a little bit about elementary and secondary education. The problems, of course, at that level are compounded when we reach college and beyond. So one of the problems is that there is not that much support for the critical transition from high school to college that Latinos make, assuming that they are able to graduate. They're among that 58% or so who finish. Now, as I mentioned before, in her memoir, Loretta Sanchez describes the lack of counseling she received about choosing a college and seeking financial aid, even though she was a gifted and highly successful student. And her story is not an isolated one. I myself received advice about going to college, not from my high school guidance counselor, but fortuitously from Dr. Edmund Deaton, who was the director of a summer program in mathematics, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. If Dr. Deaton had not taken an interest in me, I very much doubt that I would have applied to Stanford University. In fact, he not only suggested that option to me, but insisted on meeting my parents to share his views on why this mattered so much. Dr. Deaton's advice was critically important to me in making strategic choices that I did not fully understand at the time. Only after I arrived at Stanford would I come to appreciate the intensely hierarchical nature of higher education. Apparently, many Latinos are in a similar situation. According to a 2010 study, Latino applicants often had academic credentials that would have permitted them to enroll in colleges and universities that were more competitive than the ones that they actually chose. But even though Latinos were, in some sense, overqualified for the institutions they attended, they nonetheless have lagged in college completion rates. This problem is particularly serious at less competitive institutions where there are already low overall rates of graduation. In fact, at the bottom 10 schools, only 17% of Latinos matriculated within a 6-year period after enrolling. But even at selective institutions, like this one, there is a gap, although the overall graduation rates are considerably better. So here at the University of California at Berkeley, 88% of white students graduate within 6 years, but only 79% of Latinos do, a gap of 9%. Now, an even bigger problem in California than this is that many Latinos do not enroll in four-year institutions. They are enrolling in 2-year rather than 4-year colleges, and then they never transfer to an institution where they can receive a bachelor's degree. Now, this is in part an artifact of state policy. The state made a decision to focus its growth efforts on community colleges. So in the late 1990s, California added 800,000 seats to 2-year institutions, but expansion at 4-year institutions has largely come to a standstill. And I think if you think about recent enrollment cuts and efforts to bring in out-of-state students, the squeeze that you see is only going to go in the other direction, or be smaller. Now, reflecting this trend, the bulk of Latinos currently in California attending a higher institution are in the community colleges. So the number of Latinos who enrolled at a 4-year institution in California in 2005 was only 20.3%, so about 1 in 5 entered a 4-year institution. But what is more chilling is that all of those other Latinos who enrolled in community college faced very long odds of transferring. Fewer than 8% transferred to a 4-year institution. According to a recent College Board survey, our country now ranks 12th among developed nations in the number of 25 to 34-year-olds with college degrees. Once upon a time, we were first. President Obama has expressed a desire for the United States, once again, to assume its place at the top of the list. So far, his administration's reforms have focused on the student loan programs and increasing Pell Grants. But, and I think those are important steps. I think they're very important in helping people to finance higher education. But I don't think America can be number one again unless some measures are specifically targeted at the Latino population. And I want to talk in particular about the idea of grading institutions, rating them, not just on how many students they enroll, but how many students they graduate. And several scholars have suggested that the designation as a Hispanic serving institution should turn on some notion that you are actually graduating Latino students in substantial numbers once they're enrolled. And of course, if you were designated that way, federal funds could flow to you as a result. Now, the situation in California is especially urgent because, as Martin Carney writes in a recent report for PACE here at Berkeley, without an improvement in Latino college graduation rates in the state, California's economy could suffer down the road, making the state government's future financial problems even worse. And I didn't even think that was possible, but apparently Martin Carney says it is if we don't start educating our Latino student population. Now, the post-war promise of California was rooted in higher education as a critical engine of economic expansion, but that promise is fading, just as Latinos need it the most. Demographics alone cannot account entirely for the shift. For example, the state of Texas has the second largest number of Latino students, but it currently seems to be adopting this very model of higher education as a component of economic growth that California is dismantling. And it does seem to me that the polarized politics that have led to initiatives that lock in ill-considered policies must take part of the blame for the situation in which we find ourselves. These hard truths have consequences for Latino participation in graduate and professional schools. A 2006 report by UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center found that for every 100 Latino children who begin school, 54 graduate from high school, 11 graduate from college, and 4 will pursue a graduate or professional education. 1 will get a doctorate. By contrast, for every 100 white children who begin school, 85 will graduate from high school, 26 from college, and 10 will pursue graduate or professional education, although again only 1 gets a doctorate, interestingly. Now, these disparities are even more striking when you make the comparison between whites and Chicano students of Mexican origin. So as the incoming dean of UCLA School of Law, I have to grapple with the fact that enrollments of students of Mexican origin in law schools across the country has stagnated in recent years, even as the population grows by leaps and bounds. As a result, in California, Latinos make up 3.7% of all the lawyers in California, even though they make up 32.4% of the state's population. So you can really see the gap there in representation. Now, I don't want to say that there hasn't been progress since I was in school, because there has. When I went to Yale, I was actually the only person of Mexican origin in my entering class. And I joined a group that was called LANA, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, because there were not enough of us to field separate organizations. In fact, we were all sitting on a table like that. And just as a side note, the co-chair at the time that I entered Yale was a third-year law student whose name you may recognize, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latino justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, her high-profile success and that of others, I'm thinking here, for example, of Tom Syons of Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, another Yale graduate, Linda Sanchez, the representative to Congress, who I'm proud to say is a UCLA Law graduate, and many others show how far Latinos have come in the legal profession. And the good news is that though the numbers are small, the Latino attorneys are doing very well by all accounts. In California, it's also clear that when Latinos practice law, a lot of them are doing it in LA. So over half of all the Latino attorneys in this state are practicing law in the Los Angeles area, compared to 1/3 overall who practice in that area. Now, based on a survey that former Supreme Court Justice and now law professor Cruz Reynoso did, and I should, in the interest of equal time, say he's a Berkeley law graduate, he found that Latino lawyers have achieved considerable success and are highly committed to giving back to their communities in a variety of ways. And I think the good news for me as a dean is that they're also very engaged with their law school alma maters. And indeed, recently, I attended an annual gala and scholarship awards ceremony sponsored by the Mexican American Bar Foundation in Los Angeles. And every year, the amount of money that they are raising for scholarships has grown, and they are supporting many law students, I'm happy to say many at UCLA, and the turnout that night was spectacular, with leading attorneys from all sectors of practice, judges and other public officials, deans and professors, as well as students and their families. And I left feeling so affirmed by that event, because I knew that this was an example of the mentoring and support that one generation can offer the next. And I certainly felt energized at that point as a Dean-Designate to see the level of support in the Latino community for Latino law students. So let me say in closing that I think in the end, investment in education generally and higher education in particular is an act of optimism. It demonstrates a faith in the future and in the possibilities of coming generations to achieve even more than their parents and grandparents have. Lately in the media, there have been comments that America has lost its mojo, that it has gone from being a can-do country to a make-do nation. There's some notion that we simply can't afford high-quality education anymore. It's too expensive. Unfortunately, we may later discover that we paid a very high price because we confused a necessity with a luxury. Latinos have a special stake in this debate as a young population dependent on education to prepare for work and citizenship obligations. But the stakes are high for everyone. We must make sure that our nation remains competitive in an increasingly global market for human capital. Together, we can work to preserve educational opportunity, and we can recognize that mojo is not something handed down from on high, but a power we find within ourselves. Thank you.